Welcome to Thinking in Psychiatry, an Academy by Psych Scene podcast where we distill emerging research, translate evidence into practice, and support clinical decision-making for busy clinicians. I'm Dr. Sanil Rege, consultant psychiatrist and content curator at the Academy by Psych Scene. A recent Nature paper on Parkinson's disease brought renewed attention to the somato-cognitive action network, or SCAN, and to the idea that Parkinsonism is not simply a disorder of motor output, but a disorder of action, arousal, body state regulation, and cognition. This paper by Ren et al., called Parkinson's Disease as a Somato-Cognitive Action Network Disorder, was published on the 4th of February, 2026. But the main paper I want to focus on today is the broader framework beneath that idea. The paper on the brain's action mode network, or AMN. And what's so fascinating about this is that it forms the fundamental foundation of psychiatry, something that we've been modulating for a very long time, and something that Freud might have told us many decades ago. So here's the central message. The brain is not an organ that occasionally becomes active when we do something. It's active all the time. So here are some fascinating facts. The paper, titled The Brain's Action Mode Network by Dosenbach et al., published in 2025, reminds us that the brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, yet accounts for more than 20% of human energy expenditure at rest. More strikingly, over 90% of that energy supports intrinsic brain activity, not task-specific output. And when a specific region is recruited for a task, the energy used in that area only rises by about 5% over baseline. Think about that. Let me repeat it once again. We're talking about 90% of the total human energy expenditure that the brain uses is not task-specific output, it's intrinsic brain activity. And when we want to engage in a task, the energy use increases by only 5% over baseline. Let's compare that with skeletal muscle, which can increase its energy demand by up to 1,800% during exercise. And that's a very important distinction. So when your biceps contract, they clearly switch into a high energy state. The brain, however, does not work like that. The brain's already running at a very high baseline. Task performance is a relatively small modulation on top of a massive background of ongoing activity. So the question the AMN paper asks is, what is all that intrinsic activity for? Their answer is intriguing. The brain is fundamentally organized for action. Not just movement in the narrow sense, but action in the fuller biological sense. Orienting, preparing, selecting, initiating, sustaining, adjusting, and coordinating behavior in a body moving through the world. That is why the authors argue that what used to be called the singular opercular network is better understood as the action mode network. It's a network that helps the brain enter and maintain a mode of goal-directed engagement. Now, this is where the paper becomes especially useful clinically, because when we think about rest, it's not really rest. In this framework, when a person is not engaged in outward goal-directed behavior, the brain does not switch off or go quiet. It shifts simply into a different mode, the default mode. The paper describes this state as one in which the brain maintains and updates itself through intrinsic processes. So here's one way of thinking about it. When we're engaged in goal-directed activity, action mode on, we're externally oriented. Whilst the other mode, the default mode, is where the brain is intrinsically or internally oriented. In humans, that includes self-referential processing, emotional processing, recollection of prior experience, remembering, and egocentric imagining. So think about the creativity, the building of one's identity, the future aspirations. All of this happens within the default mode state. So rest is not the absence of brain function. It's an internally oriented mode of brain function. And that's a critical clinical point, because when a patient looks at rest, they're not switched off. In psychiatry, we may find patients that might be ruminating, replaying autobiographical memory. For those where threat is heightened, they may be simulating threat or rehearsing shame, reconstructing self, generating identity-level narratives. In other words, the internal mode is still metabolically expensive and still highly relevant to symptoms. So the real distinction is not between activity and inactivity, it's between action mode and default mode. The AMN paper argues, as we can see here, that these two modes are strongly counterbalanced. They are anti-correlated. The action mode network and the default mode network being anti-correlated. When one comes up or becomes active, the other tends to recede. This one comes up, this one recedes. The AMN is linked to goal-directed behavior, external or allocentric focus, heightened arousal, action planning, action initiation, sympathetic tone, and processing of action-relevant feedback such as pain, bodily state, and errors, which is what's highlighted in this table here. We see it's allocentric, it's about strive and survive, with energy use and intrinsic activity being high across both modes. The DMN sits on the other side of that balance and supports self-referential, emotional, and memory-related inner life. And that's what's described as egocentric or rest and digest modes. That push and pull relationship matters enormously in psychiatry, because many psychiatric syndromes can be understood, at least in part, as disorders of entering, sustaining, or exiting action mode appropriately. Some patients cannot get into action mode. They describe knowing what to do, but being unable to initiate. We may see psychomotor slowing, reduced spontaneity, abulia, apathy in severe cases, low drive, low motivation, anhedonia, amotivation, impaired effort allocation, and diminished behavioral drive. Others struggle to come out of action mode towards the rest mode. They remain locked into over-arousal, threat monitoring, hypervigilance, compulsive striving, or relentless mobilization. So think about the patients where action mode off or default mode or rest states are unpleasant. If I sit still, I feel uncomfortable. My emotions surface. I have to keep busy to keep my anxiety at bay. And for some patients, they oscillate poorly between the two, with unstable state shifting. This is one reason this paper is so relevant to formulation. It helps us think beyond symptom lists and towards the regulation of states, the two modes that I talked about. This paper also expands what this network actually does. The AMN is not just about executive control. That older label, the executive control network, was too narrow. The authors argue that the action mode network combines multiple functions required for successful goal-directed behavior: heightened alertness, task initiation, sustained goal maintenance, action planning, motor preparation. But here's the important thing. All of this is also linked to the autonomic nervous system, sympathetic drive, the visceral sensation, visceral motor control, pain processing, and error monitoring. So the point here is that this activity is also closely linked to the interoceptive world. In other words, it helps create the conditions for action, not just the abstract plan. Creating the conditions for action begins from an interoceptive perspective. And that shift is important because psychiatry has often inherited false dichotomies: cognition versus movement. So we might see patients as ADHD, where cognition and activity is seen without emotional regulation or interoceptive dysfunction. Mind versus body, the psychodynamic world versus the biological world, when both are integrated. The action mode network is a vertically integrated system involving the cortex, the striatum, thalamus, the cerebellum, and likely deeper arousal nuclei. Its job is to help cognition become action through the body. This is why the SCAN link matters, the somato-cognitive action network. The action mode network is strongly and specifically connected to the somato-cognitive action network, or SCAN. SCAN can be considered as integrating whole body physiology with smooth and skeletal muscle movement in the service of goal-directed actions or behavior. Now, what's interesting here is that the authors argue that the SCAN may function as the actuator of the AMN, implementing goal-directed action through coordinated skeletal movement, smooth muscle activity, and hormone-linked physiological shifts, such as increased sympathetic tone. So the more recent Parkinson's paper becomes easier to understand. So if Parkinson's disease involves dysfunction in SCAN-linked circuitry and SCAN is tightly linked to action mode network, then Parkinsonism is not simply about tremor or bradykinesia. It's about disruption of the broader architecture that supports arousal, initiation, action readiness, body state regulation, and behavioral execution. And this is why neuropsychiatric symptoms so often appear early. But here's the important message I want to touch on. This is not only relevant to Parkinson's disease, it is highly relevant to a range of psychiatric disorders, depression, to ADHD, to burnout, to PTSD, to functional somatic states, to disorders where the patient's main complaint is not sadness or anxiety in a narrow sense, but difficulty moving into life in a flexible, adaptive way. And this is why, as you know in the courses, I think that the PACES model works so well. When we assess perception, activity, cognition, emotion, emotional hedonics, and sleep, we're effectively sampling the major outputs of these integrated brain-body modes. PACES thus becomes useful because patients do not present in silos. Individuals with ADHD have emotional regulation difficulties. The DSM does not incorporate that. A person with depression may present with altered interoception, reduced activity, cognitive slowing, constipation, emotional pain, gustatory and olfactory disturbances, and sleep disruption. A patient with ADHD may present with abnormal salience, inconsistent action initiation, mental restlessness, affective dysregulation, and circadian disruption. Simply thinking along the lines of stimulant treatment does not address the other aspects of circadian disruption or affective dysregulation, etc. PACES works because it maps onto how these systems actually show up clinically. The action mode paper also offers a useful temporal layer. What I mean by that is the brain mode switching is not static. The authors describe infraslow fluctuations in the range of 0.01 to 0.2 Hz linked to arousal changes and performance variability that appear to cycle the brain along the continuum between action mode and default mode. In humans, these fluctuations are tied to spontaneous changes in arousal and are phase-shifted across functional networks, with the AMN maximally offset from the DMN, the anticorrelation. So even within an apparently stable state, the brain is dynamically modulating readiness, focus, and internal processing. So if we think about linking neurobiology to psychodynamic aspects, these processes are occurring outside conscious awareness, and this is clinically meaningful. It helps explain why performance fluctuates, why effort can be inconsistent, why some patients feel intermittently switched on or offline, and why arousal regulation matters so much in clinical practice. So let me summarize this and provide a few clinical pearls that we can apply to clinical practice. Firstly, when we think about rest, it is not switching off. we're not talking about the brain entering into a silent mode. It's an internally oriented, highly active mode. Secondly, many psychiatric symptoms are better understood as problems of mode switching or regulation rather than isolated failures of mood or cognition. And this is why, as part of the courses, the triple network model, where now we can think about action mode network, default mode network, and salience network. Each one of these networks can be expressed through a range of symptoms. Third, the action mode network gives us a language for linking movement, motivation, salience, arousal, body physiology, and cognition without the need to split them into separate specialties. And therefore, the decision-making takeaway is this. When a patient presents with impaired initiation, fatigue, psychomotor slowing, hyperarousal, poor state shifting, social withdrawal, or unstable engagement with the world, we can think beyond labels alone. We can ask, what mode is the brain stuck in? Is the individual finding it difficult to enter into action mode? Is the individual finding it difficult to exit action mode? Is rest mode unpleasant? Or is the individual oscillating poorly between action mode on and default mode? That's where the paper becomes useful. It does not replace phenomenology. It helps us sharpen it. Thank you for listening. You can find links to the article and related Academy modules where these principles are covered in the advanced formulation and strategic management, but also other courses, for example, in ADHD, where we cover the triple network model, depression, where we cover the triple network model, and show how we can use psychopharmacology and psychological principles to target the various domains. I'm Dr. Sanil Rege, and you're listening to Thinking in Psychiatry, where how we think is just as important as what we prescribe. Until next time, keep thinking carefully and keep thinking clinically. Bye-bye.